Christy Mathewson's teammate George Wiltse enters the 1908 season with a delivery that pushes the boundary between legal deception and outright quick pitching, because he prefers to release the ball before batters can fully set. When he uses the move after a brushback dispute in mid-July, opposing managers file formal complaints that the pitch violates the spirit of the set position rule, even though the written language remains vague. Umpires respond by demanding a consistent pause before delivery, which forces Wiltse to adjust a rhythm he has used for years. The league office tracks a noticeable rise in protests from Giants opponents after July 20, therefore accelerating the push for a formalized standard. By August, the National Commission signals that the loophole must close to preserve uniform timing across both leagues, and umpires enforce the change immediately. The new requirement slows Wiltse's tempo, because he can no longer disguise his readiness by blending the stretch and the release into one continuous motion. Games involving the Giants shift by several minutes on average, which owners quietly support as they seek a more predictable pace for spectators. Meanwhile, Wiltse's reputation as a control specialist, he posts a 1.97 ERA that season, helps soften the perception that the rule directly targets him. Even though the timing aligns almost perfectly with his controversial outings, the moment becomes a quiet template for later enforcement, especially as the league reviews mound behavior more carefully in the 1910 seconds. What has made the next wave of infielders trigger even stricter adjustments? Eddie Collins, the Philadelphia Athletics second baseman who averages more than 60 stolen bases per season in the early 1910 seconds, develops a sharp V-cut maneuver that lets him redirect his path mid-stride and avoid tags with unusual efficiency. By June 1911, opponents from Chicago and Street, Louis file repeated protests because they argue the move violates the league's expectation that a runner must maintain a reasonably direct line to the next base. Umpires initially ruled the tactic legal since the rulebook does not explicitly prohibit lateral jukes, but the frequency of Collins's evasions forces the American League office to review game footage and scorebook reports. As Collins records 63 steals in 1912, managers warn that his pathing exploits a loophole that compensates for slow infield relay times, therefore distorting the competitive balance between aggressive runners and standard defenders. The league prepares a mid-season clarification that restricts abrupt direction changes designed solely to obstruct a tag attempt. The American League finalizes the adjustment in a December memo that tightens the definition of obstruction and authorizes umpires to call a runner out if he deviates too far from a direct path without a legitimate defensive motive. Collins argues that the change penalizes skill rather than gamesmanship, because he maintains that the V-cut simply magnifies quick reactions rather than manufacturing an unfair advantage. Nevertheless, once the policy becomes active the following spring, runners across the league adopt more conservative angles, and the total number of successful jukes declines, which confirms for the league office that the earlier rule set allowed too much discretionary movement. Collins still posts elite numbers, recording 55 steals in 1913 and maintaining his reputation as the league's most efficient base runner. What forces Ty Cobb's spike-related behavior to trigger an entirely different category of rulemaking? Ty Cobb, the Detroit Tigers outfielder who leads the American League with a 383 average in 1910, becomes the center of a league-wide safety review after several April confrontations draw attention to the sharp metal spikes he uses during slides. Newspapers record at least 3 fights that month involving disputed takeout attempts at second base, and opponents argue that Cobb's technique seeks contact rather than territory, which forces the league to confront a gap in its rule language. By mid-summer, the American League issues $125 in cumulative fines across multiple incidents, therefore acknowledging that repeated warnings have failed to curb escalating tensions between Detroit and infielders around the league. Umpires respond with more assertive interference calls, but their authority remains limited until league officials examine written complaints submitted by Cleveland and Philadelphia. The result is a push to authorize a clearer definition of unacceptable spikes first contact. The league adds an intent-to-injure clause later that season, because executives conclude that the earlier obstruction and interference sections do not explicitly address aggressive slides designed to intimidate defenders. Detroit files a formal protest claiming that Cobb becomes a target for selective enforcement. Yet league president Van Johnson dismisses the appeal by stating that the new language applies universally, not retroactively or personally. Meanwhile, attendance in Detroit stays strong as fans chant "File the Blades" and treat the controversy as part of Cobb's competitive identity. even though defensive players record a noticeable decline in risky pivot attempts. The updated clause survives into the 1,920 and becomes the basis for later slide rule revisions that prioritize fielder safety at second base. What forces Babe Ruth's extraordinary power numbers to reshape stadium dimensions and batter-friendly conditions across the league? Babe Ruth, the New York Yankees slugger who hits 54 home runs in 1920, becomes the primary catalyst for the league's shift from the dead ball era to a livelier offensive environment that magnifies the value of long-distance hitting. As his totals rise, multiple teams react by moving their outfield fences inward or outward depending on whether they want to contain or exploit his power, which exposes the absence of a league-wide minimum distance requirement. By early July, newspapers track a spike in formal complaints accusing clubs of park tailoring because some dimensions shrink below 250 feet down the foul lines, therefore skewing competitive integrity. MLB responds by studying stadium maps from all 8 American League parks and notes several fields where improvised alterations occur without advance approval. The league therefore authorizes a new baseline rule establishing 250-foot minimum markers, even though the directive cannot immediately force renovations in every park. Once the minimum distance guideline becomes public, owners argue that quick compliance would require construction timelines that exceed the off-season, but the rule still signals that unregulated park manipulation has reached a limit. Meanwhile, Ruth maintains an 847 OPS during the summer, despite opponents tailoring outfields to disrupt his launch angles, which proves to league officials that uneven park dimensions do not meaningfully restrict an elite power hitter under the new ball conditions. Attendance records confirm the shift in fan expectations, because crowds increase as home run totals rise, therefore reinforcing MLB's interest in standardizing the aesthetics and difficulty of long ball hitting. The league's intervention also begins a multi-year process of monitoring outfield adjustments, a practice that becomes standard by the mid-1920s. What element of Johnny Evers' involvement in the Merkle incident pushes MLB toward one of the most enduring rule clarifications in baseball history? Johnny Evers, the Chicago Cubs second baseman who averages more than 600 defensive innings per season in the late 1900s, becomes the central figure in one of baseball's most cited rule clarifications, after the 1908 incident later known as Merkle's boner. The controversy begins the previous year, when force play language still leaves ambiguity about whether a run can score if a runner fails to touch the next base during a live ball sequence that ends a game. Evers repeatedly exploits this gap throughout the 1907 season because he understands that a force remains active until all runners legally advance, therefore allowing Chicago to nullify scoring plays if a trailing runner misses a base. On the 23rd of September 1908, umpire Hank O'Day issues a post-game ruling that upholds Evers' assertion that Fred Merkle never touched second base, which erases the Giants' apparent walk-off and forces a replay that Chicago ultimately wins. The league recognizes that inconsistencies in force play language threaten competitive legitimacy, especially in late-season pennant races. The National League codifies a precise live ball tag requirement the following winter, because executives want umpires to follow an explicit standard rather than rely on post-game interpretation. The revised language states that a force remains active until a defensive player physically tags the missed base with the live ball, which aligns exactly with Evers' tactical reading and ensures uniform enforcement across all parks. Chicago continues using the clarified provision during the 1909 season, therefore gaining value from a rule they helped expose, although other teams quickly adapt by drilling their runners on mandatory base touches. The force play clarification survives largely unchanged into the modern era because it resolves a recurring ambiguity without altering the structure of base running, and because it provides a simple directive that matches the logic of possession and advancement. What pressures Lefty Grove's pace manipulation tactics to trigger a league response that targets mound visits and tempo control? Lefty Grove, the Philadelphia Athletics ace who records a 2.06 ERA in 1931, becomes a focus of a league review when opposing managers complain that extended mound visits artificially reset his rhythm and slow the overall pace of play. The issue escalates on a July afternoon when manager Connie Mack makes 9 separate trips to the mound in a single inning, each one delaying the next pitch and disrupting hitters who rely on consistent timing. Umpires document the sequence in their post-game report because they recognize that no existing language restricts the number or duration of visits, therefore giving teams unchecked authority to manipulate tempo. League officials compare game logs across the season and find a pattern of Philadelphia using prolonged conferences whenever Grove faces high-leverage counts, which convinces the American League that the practice inflates game times and undermines competitive flow. The league prepares to introduce a formal time cap that can be uniformly enforced. By August, the American League circulates a memo establishing a 30-second limit on mound visits because executives conclude that tighter boundaries will protect hitters from extended in-inning delays while still allowing essential communication. Mack publicly argues that the guideline interferes with managerial discretion, yet compliance becomes mandatory after umpires begin timing visits with stopwatches and recording violations in daily reports. Meanwhile, Grove continues to dominate despite the new rule, finishing the season with 31 wins and one of the lowest ERAs in franchise history, which undermines the claim that rapid-fire pacing disadvantages elite pitchers. Hitters, however, report that the tempo shifts overnight because the rule reduces their rest moments between pitches and forces quicker readiness in the batter's box. What changed to Jackie Robinson's base-running pressure eventually compels the league to clarify its balk and feint regulations. Jackie Robinson, the Brooklyn Dodgers infielder who integrates Major League Baseball in 1947, immediately pressures pitchers with a base-running style built on aggressive leads and repeated feints. He steals 29 bases as a rookie, but the more significant metric emerges in how frequently he forces pitchers into hesitant motions that blur the line between a legal step-off and an illegal balk. Umpires record a surge in complaints from St. Louis and Boston because Robinson's constant movement disrupts traditional timing cues, therefore exposing loopholes in the National League's disengagement language. By late summer, league officials review game film and determine that current rules lack enough specificity to penalize deceptive or incomplete throwing motions. The NL therefore begins drafting a clarification to regulate feints more strictly when a pitcher toes the rubber. The following offseason, the league rewrites its disengagement and balk clauses to specify when a pitcher must commit to home plate and when a pickoff attempt constitutes a live throw rather than a bluff. Pitchers argue that the changes target Robinson personally because managers produce internal scouting notes showing that he provokes more hesitation balks than any other runner during the 1,947-48 span. Meanwhile, Robinson adapts easily, scoring 125 runs in 1949 by reading pitchers' shoulders, back feet, and breath patterns, rather than relying solely on exaggerated feints. The tightened rules therefore standardize pitcher behavior without reducing the impact of an elite base runner who excels at exploiting timing stress rather than technical loopholes. What element of Stan Musial's left-handed power prompts the league to confront early defensive shifting and position depth concerns? Stan Musial, the St. Louis Cardinals outfielder, who hits 376 inches, 1,948, becomes the focal point of the National League's first documented attempt to regulate extreme defensive shifting. As Musial posts an OPS above 1 for the third time in 4 seasons, opponents begin overloading the right side of the infield with 3 defenders stationed well beyond traditional depth because they believe his pull tendency on low fastballs justifies the risk. The Cardinals respond by tracking more than 20 defensive alignments they consider mispositioned during the first half of the season, and their internal reports note that several clubs place fielders so deep into short right field that they resemble outfielders rather than infielders. League umpires review those alignments and warn teams that positioning players beyond a reasonable depth violates the intent of the infield rule, even though no specific distance standard exists. The NL therefore begins drafting language to narrow the gray area between tactical freedom and improper deployment. By August, the National League circulates an advisory that instructs umpires to monitor infield depth more closely and to intervene when a defender's starting position effectively creates an unapproved fourth outfielder. Managers argue that the notice targets Musial because his contact profile, he records 230 hits that season, makes him uniquely sensitive to overloaded zones, yet league officials insist the goal is uniformity rather than protection. Meanwhile, Musial continues producing at an elite level despite the alignments, recording multi-hit games in 13 of his final 20 appearances and demonstrating that even early shifts cannot erase his bat-to-ball efficiency. The league refrains from codifying strict shift limits, but the 1,948 advisory becomes an early template for later debates about defensive freedom and competitive fairness. What aspect of Mickey Mantle's speed down the first base line prompts a different kind of rule clarification involving bunt paths and runner interference? Mickey Mantle, the New York Yankees center fielder who reaches home to first in 3.9 seconds at his peak, forces the league to confront an overlooked detail in the batter-runner lane rule during the 1956 season. Mantle's drag bunts travel so softly up the first baseline that umpires struggle to determine when he is entitled to use the foul line lane and when he must remain inside the prescribed 3-foot path. Opponents argue that his exceptional acceleration creates an unfair margin because he can angle several steps onto fair territory before fielders complete their charge, therefore complicating obstruction and interference interpretations. Umpire crews document multiple instances in early May when Mantle beats throws by fractions of a second while running inside the lane, and they warn the league office that the ambiguity increases the probability of collision. The American League begins reviewing footage and play-by-play data to determine how often Mantle's route deviates from a direct line standard that the existing wording only vaguely addresses. The league responds later that summer by clarifying the direct run path language and authorizing umpires to call interference more readily if the batter-runner steps onto the infield side of the lane without a legitimate baseball reason. Mantle adapts without difficulty because his timing advantage does not depend on a wide running angle, and his drag bunt success rate remains high despite narrower enforcement. Meanwhile, Yankees coaches note that the updated interpretation reduces defensive hesitation, since fielders can now assume a consistent lane boundary when charging slow rollers. The rule therefore standardizes a gray area that Mantle's speed exposed, while still allowing elite runners to extract value from timing rather than path manipulation. What aspect of Don Larsen's mound positioning during his 1956 postseason run pushes the league to refine its foot placement guidelines on the pitching rubber? Don Larsen, the New York Yankees right-hander who throws a perfect game in Game 5 of the 1956 World Series, becomes the center of a technical review after broadcasters draw attention to the angle of his pivot foot on the rubber. Slow-motion replays from the national telecast show his right foot turning several degrees toward third base at set position, which raises questions about whether the orientation violates the league's expectation that a pitcher face home plate squarely before delivery. Opponents argue that the alignment provides a minor advantage by opening Larsen's stride and hiding the ball longer, therefore prompting umpires to record the exact placement of his foot during postseason inspections. When the league office reviews those reports, it notes that Larsen's stride length is measured 3 separate times during the series, indicating heightened concern even as the performance itself dominates headlines. The American League concludes that the existing rule phrasing lacks sufficient specificity to govern foot angle and alignment on the rubber. During the winter of 1956-57, the AL drafts a clarification that requires pitchers to maintain both feet in a consistent orientation relative to the plate whenever they engage the rubber, because officials want a standard that eliminates interpretive variance among umpire crews. Complaints from Cleveland and Chicago highlight how ambiguous language complicates balk enforcement, especially when a pitcher's foot position appears to initiate motion toward a base rather than home. Once spring training begins in 1957, the league distributes updated guidelines that tighten the definitions around set position, stride direction, and pivot foot stability, which gives umpires explicit authority to warn or penalize borderline alignments. Larsen adapts without difficulty, recording a 3.74 ERA that season, but his postseason visibility ensures that the revised rule gains wide acceptance across both leagues. What element of Maury Wills' stolen base explosion soon forces MLB to confront the pace effects of pickoff attempts and disengagement patterns?